The rifle clicked. The sound echoed through the silent courtyard as the guard's finger tightened on the trigger. A young woman stood frozen, mere inches from the sentry box, her face drained of all color. She had crossed the rope barrier without thinking, eager to get the perfect photograph of the stoic Queen's Guard in his scarlet coat and bearskin cap. Now she stood in what could be considered a threat zone, and the guard's training demanded he respond. Time seemed to stop. Tourists gasped. Cameras stopped clicking. Even the London traffic noise faded into the background. The guard's eyes, usually fixed straight ahead in that famously blank stare, had shifted. He was looking directly at her now, his weapon raised to the ready position. This was the moment when protocol met humanity. When centuries of military tradition collided with basic human compassion, but then something unexpected happened. The guard's stern expression softened, almost imperceptibly. He lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately. Instead of the harsh shout that usually accompanied such breaches, he spoke in a gentle voice that barely anyone heard. "Miss, please, step back behind the rope. I don't want you to get hurt." The woman stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face. Nodding frantically as she retreated to safety, what no one knew was that this guard, Corporal James Richardson, had seen something in that split second that changed everything. The woman wore a hospital bracelet. Her hands were shaking not just from fear, but from something else. In her other hand, she clutched a photograph of a young man in military uniform. In that brief moment of eye contact, James recognized something he had seen before, a sister mourning her brother, a soldier who had fallen in service. She had come to Buckingham Palace not just as a tourist, but as someone seeking connection to her lost sibling. Through the only soldiers she could still see standing guard, after his shift ended, James did something he had never done before. He found the woman sitting on a bench outside the palace gate, still visibly shaken. Still in his uniform, though now technically off-duty, he approached her carefully. She looked up, terrified that she was about to be arrested or reprimanded further. Instead, James sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm sorry I frightened you," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand that those barriers are there for your safety and mine. If you had been someone else, someone with ill intent, the outcome could have been very different." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. My brother." She couldn't finish the sentence, instead holding up the photograph. It showed a young soldier in the same regiment James served in, though from several years earlier. James looked at the photograph, then back at the woman. "What was his name?" David Mitchell. "He served in Afghanistan. He died 3 years ago this week." Her voice broke. "I came here because I needed to feel close to him somehow. The guards, the ceremony, the tradition. It was his dream to serve here at the palace. He wrote me letters about it." Something shifted in James's carefully composed military bearing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin, a challenge coin from their regiment. "David Mitchell. I knew him. We trained together before his deployment. He was a good man, a good soldier. He talked about his sister all the time. He was proud of you." The woman stared at James in disbelief. Of all the guards at the palace, of all the people in London, she had unknowingly approached someone who actually knew her brother. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet here it was, unfolding before her. "He mentioned me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Often," James confirmed. "He showed me your picture once. You were graduating from university?" He carried that photo with him everywhere. James paused, then did something that went against every fiber of his training. He removed his bearskin cap, setting it carefully on the bench beside him. Without the formal headgear, he looked younger, more human, more like the ordinary man behind the uniform. "I'm not supposed to do this," he continued, "but I think David would want me to. Your brother was brave, kind, and dedicated. He died doing what he loved, serving his country. But more than that, he died thinking of you, hoping you would live a full, happy life. He made me promise once, half joking, that if anything happened to him, I would tell his sister not to be sad forever." The woman began to cry openly now, but these were different tears. Not tears of fear or even grief alone, but tears of unexpected connection, of closure she never thought she would find. "Thank you," she managed to say between sobs. "Thank you so much." James stood, preparing to leave, knowing he had already broken numerous protocols by having this conversation. But before he put his cap back on, before he returned to being the stoic, untouchable figure of military precision, he did one more thing. He saluted the photograph of David Mitchell, a crisp, perfect military salute that held all the respect and honor one soldier could show another. "Your brother was a hero," James said, "and you should be proud. But more than that, you should live." That's what he wanted. That's what we all want for the people we protect. The woman watched as James replaced his bearskin cap, transforming once again into the formal, a distant figure of a Queen's Guard, but now she knew the truth that so many people forget beneath those imposing uniforms. Behind those expressionless faces stood real people with real hearts, real memories, and real capacity for kindness. As James walked away, back toward the palace to file his NWS 5th reports, he knew he would face questions about his interaction. There would be cameras, witnesses, perhaps even disciplinary action for breaking character. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had honored a fallen brother in arms. He had brought comfort to a grieving sister. He had reminded himself, and anyone watching, that sometimes the most important duty a soldier has is not to protocol or tradition, but to basic human decency. The woman sat on that bench for a long time afterward, clutching her brother's photograph in the memory of this unexpected encounter. When she finally stood to leave, she looked back at the palace gates one more time. The new guard on duty stood perfectly still, rifle at the ready, face expressionless. But now, when she looked at him, she didn't see just a statue or a tourist attraction. She saw a real person, someone's son or brother, someone with their own stories and struggles, someone capable of extraordinary kindness in the midst of rigid duty. She would tell this story for years to come, not as a tale of breaking rules or military misconduct, but as a reminder that compassion can exist anywhere, even in the most unlikely places, even behind the most formal facades. The guards at Buckingham Palace were not just symbols or ceremonial figures. They were human beings, and sometimes, just sometimes, that humanity shone through in the most beautiful ways. The video went viral within hours. Someone had recorded the entire encounter between James and the woman on their phone. From the tense moment when he raised his rifle to the gentle way he spoke to her afterward, the footage showed James finding her on the bench, sitting beside her, removing his cap, saluting the photograph. By the next morning, it had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms worldwide. Comments flooded in from every corner of the globe. Some praised James for his compassion. Others criticized him for breaking protocol. Military analysts debated whether his actions set a dangerous precedent. But amid all the noise and controversy, something else was happening. Other guards, both current and former, began sharing their own stories of moments when they had chosen kindness over rigid adherence to rules. One such story came from Stockholm, Sweden. A royal guard named Eric Anderson had been standing his post outside the royal palace when a small child, no more than 5 years old, wandered away from his parents. The boy was fascinated by Eric's tall hat and blue uniform. He walked right up to the guard, oblivious to any concept of boundaries or protocol. Eric was supposed to remain perfectly still, unmoved by any distraction. That was his duty, his training, his entire purpose in that moment. But the child began to cry. He had realized he was lost, separated from his family in a crowd of strangers. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he looked up at Eric with terrified eyes. The guard could hear the parents frantically calling the child's name somewhere in the distance, but they couldn't see him through the throng of tourists. Eric made a decision in that instant. He broke formation, knelt down to the child's level, and spoke in a soft, reassuring voice. "It's okay, little one. We'll find your mama and papa." "Don't be scared," picked up the crying boy, held him safely in his arms, and began walking through the crowd, using his commanding presence to part the sea of people. Within moments, he reunited the child with his weeping mother and relieved father. The entire interaction lasted less than 3 minutes. Eric returned to his post, resumed his rigid stance, and continued his duty as if nothing had happened. But a tourist had captured the moment on camera. The image of the imposing Swedish guard in full ceremonial dress, cradling a tiny crying child with such gentleness, became one of the most shared photographs of that year. When asked about it later, Eric simply said, "I am a soldier, yes. But before that, I am a human being. No rule or regulation is more important than a child's safety and comfort. If my superiors want to punish me for that, so be it. I would make the same choice again without hesitation." His superiors did not punish him. Instead, they quietly commended him for his judgment and compassion. The incident sparked a broader conversation within Royal Guard units across Europe about the balance between maintaining tradition and showing basic humanity. In Denmark, another story emerged. A guard named Henrik had been standing watch outside Amalienborg Palace when an elderly woman collapsed near his post. She had been part of a tour group, but the summer heat had been too much for her. She fell to the ground, unconscious. Her companions frozen in shock and uncertainty. Henrik immediately called for medical assistance through his radio, then dropped to his knees beside the woman. He had been trained in first aid as part of his military preparation. He checked her pulse, made sure her airway was clear, positioned her in the recovery position, and stayed with her, monitoring her breathing and speaking calmly to her, even though she couldn't hear him. "You're going to be okay," he told her. "Help is coming. Just hold on. You're safe now." When the paramedics arrived minutes later, they told Henrik that his quick response had likely saved the woman's life. She had suffered heat stroke and could have died if left unattended. The woman recovered fully and later wrote a letter to the Danish Royal Guard, expressing her gratitude to the soldier who had abandoned his ceremonial duty to save her life. Henrik's commanding officer shared the letter with him privately. "You represent the best of what we are," the officer told him. "These uniforms, these traditions, they exist to honor something greater than ourselves. You honored that by valuing a human life above standing still in a fancy coat. Never apologize for that." Back in London, James Richardson was called into his commanding officer's office. 3 days after his encounter with David Mitchell's sister, he expected discipline, perhaps even dismissal from the prestigious posting. Instead, he found something entirely different. His commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Stewart, was a stern man with 30 years of military service. He had seen combat, trained countless soldiers, and upheld the strictest standards of military bearing. James stood at attention, ready to accept whatever judgment came. "At ease, Corporal," the colonel said. James relaxed slightly, but remained alert. The colonel pulled up the viral video on his computer screen, the one showing James's compassionate interaction with the grieving woman. "I've watched this about 50 times now," Colonel Stewart said. "I've read the thousands of comments. I've fielded calls from media outlets around the world. I've had discussions with senior officers about protocol and precedent." He paused, studying James's face. "Do you know what I think about all of it?" "No, sir," James replied, his voice steady despite his internal nervousness. "I think," the colonel continued, "that you exemplified the very best of what it means to be a Queen's Guard. Not because you stood perfectly still. Not because you followed every rule without question. But because when faced with a choice between rigid protocol and human compassion, you chose compassion without compromising safety or security." James felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. The colonel stood from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds. "These traditions we uphold, Corporal Richardson, they're not just about pageantry or tourism. They're about honor, duty, and service. Service to the crown, yes, but ultimately service to the people. That woman needed something from you that day, and you gave it to her. You served her, and in doing so, you served everything we stand for." News of the guard encounters spread far beyond Europe. In Thailand, where royal guards maintain similar traditions of stillness and ceremony, a young guard named Samchi faced his own moment of choice outside the Grand Palace in Bangkok. A stray dog, thin and limping, wandered into the courtyard during his watch. The animal was clearly injured, dragging one hind leg and whimpering in pain. Samchai was expected to remain motionless, to ignore all distractions. Animals wandered into the palace grounds occasionally, and other staff would eventually deal with them. But this dog was suffering, and it had approached Samchai specifically. As if sensing that humans in uniform might provide help rather than harm, the dog sat down directly in front of Samchai, looking up at him with pleading eyes. Its tail made a weak attempt at wagging. Samchai could see a deep cut on the dog's leg, likely from broken glass or sharp metal. The wound was fresh, still bleeding, without breaking his formal stance completely. Samchai made eye contact with his fellow guards stationed nearby. A subtle nod, an understanding passed between them. The second guard discreetly radioed for assistance while maintaining his post. Samchai, meanwhile, slowly and carefully knelt down, extending his hand to the frightened animal. "Little friend," he whispered in Thai, "let me help you." The dog, sensing kindness, allowed Samchai to examine the wound. Using his clean handkerchief, the guard applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Within minutes, palace staff arrived with a first aid kit for animals. They had dealt with similar situations before, but never had they seen a royal guard personally tending to a stray. Samchai stayed with the dog until it was safely in the hands of veterinary care. The animal was treated, fed, and eventually adopted by one of the palace staff members. But the image of the ceremonial guard in his white and gold uniform, kneeling to comfort a suffering creature, touched hearts across Thailand and beyond. The Thai royal guard released a statement afterward. "Our guards protect all beings within the palace grounds, regardless of species. Compassion is not a breach of duty. It is the highest expression of it." In Japan, outside the imperial palace in Tokyo, a different kind of moment unfolded. Guard Takeshi Yamamoto maintained his position during the cherry blossom season, when thousands of tourists visited to photograph the beautiful trees. Among the crowds was a young girl in a wheelchair, accompanied by her elderly grandfather. The girl, maybe 12 years old, had been sick for a long time. The grandfather had brought her to see the palace and the cherry blossoms, knowing it might be one of her last chances to experience such beauty. But the crowds were dense, and the wheelchair couldn't navigate. Through to get a good view of the guards in their traditional dress, the grandfather tried to maneuver closer. But people were packed tightly, unwilling to move. The girl craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the impressive guard she had seen in pictures and read about in books. Her face showed both excitement and disappointment. So close, yet unable to see. Takeshi noticed the struggle. He could see the girl's pale complexion, the medical equipment attached to her wheelchair, the grandfather's desperate eyes. Protocol dictated he remain in place, eyes forward, expression neutral. But Takeshi had a younger sister who had survived cancer. He knew what it meant to cherish every moment, every experience. He did something unprecedented. He marched in perfect military form directly to where the girl sat in her wheelchair. The crowd parted in shock and confusion. What was the guard doing? Had something gone wrong? Takeshi stopped precisely in front of the wheelchair, came to attention, and performed an impeccable ceremonial salute directly to the young girl. Her eyes widened in wonder and delight. The grandfather began to cry. For 30 full seconds, Takeshi maintained that salute, giving the girl the experience she had dreamed of, making her feel seen, valued, and honored. Then, just as formally as he had approached, Takeshi marched back to his original position and resumed his duty. The entire sequence had taken less than a minute, but its impact would last a lifetime. The girl smiled, broader than she had in months. She raised her thin arm in a return salute, tears of joy streaming down her face. That image, captured by dozens of cameras, went around the world. The Japanese Imperial Guard received thousands of letters praising Takeshi's actions. The girl's grandfather wrote, "In a world that often overlooks the sick and disabled, that guard reminded my granddaughter that she matters, that she is worthy of honor and respect." He gave her a moment of pure happiness in a very difficult time. I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life." 3 months later, the girl passed away. At her funeral, displayed prominently among family photos, was the image of Guard Yamamoto saluting her. Her grandfather reported that she had talked about that moment every single day until she died, telling everyone who visited about the kind soldier who broke tradition to make her feel special. These stories continued to emerge from around the world. In Canada, a ceremonial guard at Parliament Hill noticed a veteran in a wheelchair struggling to get close enough for a photo. The guard left his post, wheeled the veteran to the perfect spot, helped take the photo, and thanked the veteran for his service before returning to duty in Greece. An Evzone guard outside the tomb of the unknown soldier saw a young boy wearing a prosthetic leg, watching the ceremony with fascination. During the changing of the guard, that Evzone made a subtle adjustment to his route, marching directly past the boy and giving him the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Soldier to soldier, honoring the boy's own battle with adversity. In Monaco, a palace guard noticed an elderly woman who had traveled from across the world to visit the palace, where her late husband had once served. She stood in the rain, too emotional to move, memories overwhelming her. The guard quietly brought her an umbrella, stood with her for several minutes in silent solidarity, and then escorted her to a covered area where she could compose herself. Each story shared a common thread. Guards trained to be unapproachable, disciplined to ignore distractions, choosing instead to see the humans before them. They risked reprimand, broke centuries-old protocols, and challenged the very notion of what it meant to serve. And in doing so, they reminded the world that true strength isn't found in rigid adherence to rules, but in knowing when compassion matters more. The conversation these moments sparked reached the highest levels of military and royal establishments worldwide. Questions emerged. Should protocols be formally amended? Should guards be given more discretion? How do you balance tradition with humanity? There were no easy answers, but the discussion itself represented progress. 6 months after his encounter with David Mitchell's sister, James Richardson received an invitation that surprised him. The Royal British Legion, a charity supporting veterans and their families, asked him to speak at their annual gathering. The organization had been following the story and believed James represented something important about modern military service. James accepted, though public speaking terrified him far more than any ceremonial duty ever had. On the evening of the event, he stood before hundreds of veterans, active military personnel, and families of fallen soldiers. Among them, sitting in the front row, was Sarah Mitchell. David's sister James had stayed in touch with Sarah since their first meeting. They had coffee occasionally, and he had introduced her to other soldiers who had served with David. The connection had been healing for both of them. Sarah found peace through stories about her brother's life and service. James found purpose in honoring his fallen friend's memory. "Good evening," James began, his voice slightly shaky but growing stronger. "I'm not here tonight as an expert or a hero. I'm here as someone who made a choice, and I want to talk about why that choice matters." He told the story of that day, of seeing Sarah cross the barrier, of recognizing her grief, of choosing compassion over protocol. But then he went deeper, sharing things he had never spoken about publicly. "When I joined the military, I thought being a good soldier meant following orders without question, maintaining discipline no matter what, never showing weakness or emotion. And those things have their place. Discipline saves lives. Order prevents chaos. But somewhere along the way, some of us forget that we're not robots. We're human beings entrusted with protecting other human beings." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "David Mitchell was my friend," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He died serving our country. He died protecting people he would never meet in a place far from home. And his sister Sarah came to the palace that day not to cause trouble, not to break rules, but to feel close to him one more time. If I had shouted at her, threatened her, treated her like a security risk instead of a grieving sister, what would that say about what David died for?" Sarah was crying quietly, but she was smiling too. Around the room, veterans nodded in understanding. Every person we encounter while serving, whether we're on the front lines or standing guard at a palace? Is someone's son or daughter? Someone's parent or sibling? Someone's friend or loved one? They deserve our protection, yes, but they also deserve our humanity. The uniform doesn't make us less human. If anything, it should make us more aware of our obligation to treat others with dignity and respect. James paused, collecting himself. Since that day with Sarah, I've heard from guards around the world who faced similar moments of choice. Some chose compassion. Some chose strict protocol. I don't judge anyone for following the rules they were taught. But I do believe we need to talk about when rules should bend, when humanity should take precedence. When doing the right thing matters more than doing the technically correct thing. A retired general in the audience raised his hand. James nodded to him. Corporal Richardson, the general said, "What do you say to those who argue that making exceptions, even for good reasons, undermines military discipline and sets dangerous precedents?" It was the question James had anticipated and dreaded. He took a breath before answering. "Sir, with respect, I would say that good judgment is part of military discipline. We train soldiers to assess situations, identify threats, and respond appropriately. If we train them to be thinking, competent professionals in combat, but demand they become unthinking automatons during ceremonial duty, we're sending a mixed message. The same soldier who can make life or death decisions in the field should be trusted to recognize when a grieving woman poses no security threat and deserves basic human kindness." The general considered this, then nodded slowly. "A fair point, Corporal." Another voice came from the back of the room, a young woman who identified herself as an active duty soldier. "I'm scheduled to begin training for ceremonial guard duty next month. After hearing these stories, I'm honestly confused about what's expected of me. How do I know when to bend and when to stand firm?" James smiled at her. "That's the hardest question of all, and I don't have a perfect answer. But I can tell you what I ask myself. Is someone in danger? Is security actually compromised? Or am I about to enforce a rule just because it's a rule, even if doing so causes unnecessary harm or distress?" Those questions help guide me. They won't make every decision easy, but they remind me why the rules exist in the first place, to protect people, not to diminish them. The discussion continued for over an hour. Veterans shared their own experiences of balancing duty and compassion. Family members of fallen soldiers thanked James for honoring their loved ones through his actions. Active military personnel debated the nuances of when exceptions should be made. Through it all, consensus emerged. The guards who had chosen kindness hadn't weakened their military bearing. If anything, they had strengthened it by demonstrating that true discipline includes the wisdom to know when rules serve their purpose and when they get in the way of the deeper mission. Near the end of the evening, Sarah Mitchell stood to speak. The room quieted immediately, recognizing her significance to the story. "My brother David loved being a soldier," she said. "He believed in service, in duty, in protecting others. But he was also the kindest person I've ever known. He would stop to help strangers, spend time with children, volunteer at shelters. When he died, I struggled to reconcile those two parts of him, the warrior and the gentle soul. They seemed contradictory." She turned to James. "But when Corporal Richardson sat with me that day, when he told me about David and saluted his photograph, I finally understood. My brother wasn't kind despite being a soldier. He was a good soldier because he was kind. The same qualities that made him compassionate made him brave. He fought to protect people because he genuinely cared about people. That's what makes someone a true protector." The room erupted in applause. Veterans stood, many with tears in their eyes, recognizing the truth in Sarah's words. After the event ended, James found himself surrounded by people wanting to thank him, share their stories, or simply shake his hand. An elderly man waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then approached James with careful steps. "Corporal Richardson," the man said. "I served with the Queen's Guard in the 1960s. Back then, showing any emotion or breaking character for any reason would have meant immediate discipline, possibly discharge. The fact that your commanders supported your actions shows how far we've come. But it also shows how far we still need to go. Keep telling this story. Keep reminding people that soldiers are humans first." James shook the man's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." that means more than you know." A year after the viral video, James Richardson received a letter that would change his perspective on everything that had happened. It came from a young man in Australia, a teenager named Marcus Chen, who had seen the video and felt compelled to share his own story. Marcus wrote about struggling with severe depression after his father, a military officer, died by suicide. The family had been devastated, not just by the loss, but by the stigma surrounding mental health in military culture. Marcus had begun to believe that soldiers were supposed to be tough, emotionless, incapable of vulnerability. He internalized this message, refusing to seek help or talk about his pain. Then he saw the video of James comforting Sarah Mitchell. He saw a uniformed soldier removing his cap, showing emotion, offering comfort. He saw strength expressed through gentleness rather than stoicism. It fundamentally challenged Marcus's assumptions about what it meant to be in military service. "Your willingness to show compassion saved my life," Marcus wrote. "I realized that being strong doesn't mean hiding your feelings. It means having the courage to be human, to connect with others, to ask for help when you need it. I started therapy. I talked to my family. I'm still struggling, but I'm fighting now instead of giving up. Thank you for showing me that real soldiers can be kind." James read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He had never imagined his actions could have such far-reaching impact. He called Sarah immediately to share the news. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking, "a kid in Australia says our story saved his life. A teenager who lost his dad and was drowning in grief saw the video and found hope. Because I sat with you. Because I talked about David, because we showed that grief and strength can coexist." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the weight of it. "David would be so proud," she finally said. "Not just of you, but of what this has all become. It's like he's still protecting people, even now." James spent the next several months corresponding with Marcus, offering support and encouragement. He also started volunteering with organizations focused on military mental health, using his platform to advocate for emotional openness and vulnerability in armed forces culture. Meanwhile, other guards whose stories had gone viral found themselves in similar positions. Eric from Sweden, Henrik from Denmark, Samchai from Thailand, Takeshi from Japan, all of them became unexpected advocates for compassionate service. They spoke at schools, visited hospitals, participated in veteran support programs, and consistently delivered the same message. True strength includes kindness. The collective impact led to tangible changes. Several countries updated their ceremonial guard protocols to explicitly authorize guards to respond to medical emergencies, assist vulnerable individuals, and use judgment in situations requiring human compassion. The changes didn't eliminate discipline or tradition. They simply acknowledged that both could coexist with humanity. Training programs began incorporating scenarios where guards had to balance protocol with compassion. Instructors taught new recruits not just how to stand perfectly still, but how to recognize when stillness served the mission and when action better honored their duty to protect and serve. Colonel Stewart, James's commanding officer, became a vocal supporter of these reforms. He testified before military committees, sharing how James's actions had actually enhanced rather than diminished the Queen's Guard's reputation. Tourism increased. Public approval ratings for the military rose. Young people expressed greater interest in service, inspired by guards who represented both tradition and humanity. "We were worried that showing emotion would make us seem weak," the colonel explained to a parliamentary committee. But the opposite proved true. People respect strength, but they trust kindness. By allowing our guards to be both disciplined and compassionate, we've strengthened the bond between military and civilian populations. Sarah Mitchell continued her own journey of healing. She started a foundation in David's name, supporting military families dealing with grief. James served on the foundation's board, helping to ensure that other families would have resources and support that Sarah initially lacked. Together, they created a network of current and former military personnel who offered peer support to those struggling with loss. One day, 3 years after their first encounter, Sarah called James with news. "I'm engaged," she said, her voice full of joy. "His name is Thomas," He's a teacher. David would have loved him. James felt a wave of emotion. Sarah, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I want you at the wedding, Sarah said. Not as a guest, but as family. You've been more than just someone who knew David. You've been a friend, support, a reminder that David's legacy lives on. Will you walk me down the aisle? James was speechless. Finally, he managed to say, "It would be my honor." At the wedding, which took place in a small church near the palace, James stood in his dress uniform. He had been granted special permission to wear it for the ceremony. As he walked Sarah down the aisle, he thought about all the unexpected paths life had taken since that day at the sentry box. One moment of choosing compassion over protocol had led to this. A grieving sister, now radiant with joy. Finding love and happiness again. During the reception, Thomas approached James privately. Sarah told me everything, he said. About David, about your friendship with him, about how you helped her through the darkest time of her life. I just want you to know that I'll do everything I can to honor David's memory and take care of his sister. Mom shook Thomas's hand firmly. David would have wanted Sarah to be happy. Thank you for giving her that. The celebration continued late into the night. Veterans who had served with David attended, sharing stories and laughter. The foundation's supporters were there, celebrating not just a wedding, but the healing power of community and connection. And throughout it all, James reflected on how a single choice, made in an instant of recognizing another person's pain, had rippled outward in ways he never could have predicted. As the years passed, the stories of guards showing compassion became less remarkable and more expected. New recruits joined ceremonial units, already aware that their role included both maintaining tradition and recognizing humanity. The viral videos that had once seemed so unusual became examples of standard best practice. James eventually retired from active duty, but he never stopped advocating for compassionate service. He taught courses on leadership and ethics, always emphasizing that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. He shared Marcus's letter with every class, reminding students that their actions, even small ones, could have profound impacts on others. On the 10th anniversary of his encounter with Sarah, James returned to Buckingham Palace. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a civilian visiting the same spot where everything had changed. A young guard stood at the sentry box, perfectly still, eyes forward. Maintaining the tradition that had existed for centuries, James watched for a while, remembering what it felt like to stand in that position, to feel the weight of the uniform and the responsibility it represented. Then he noticed a small child approaching the rope barrier, fascinated by the guard's impressive appearance. The child's mother called out, warning him to stay back. But the child was already too close. The guard's eyes shifted, just slightly looking at the child. Then, in a gentle voice, he said, "Hello there, young man. Impressive toy soldier you have there. Does he guard your room, like I guard the palace?" The child giggled, holding up his toy. The mother relaxed, smiling gratefully at the guard. It was a small moment, a tiny breach of the stoic facade, but it was also a sign that things had changed, that the lessons learned from those viral moments had taken root. James smiled as he walked away. The tradition would continue. The guards would still stand tall, still maintain discipline, still honor centuries of military heritage. But now they would also remember that beneath the uniform, they were human. And sometimes, being human was the most important duty of all.